Hello, and welcome to our series of podcasts that we call Bytesize, where we discuss the role and impact of cybersecurity that touch the many facets of our lives. My name is Raymond Lee, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at VKey. And I'll be your host in this episode, where we will get a perspective on how and why security is becoming more important in the world of Internet of Things, or what we call IoT. Today, I'm joined by Joseph Gan, the CEO and co-founder at VKey, to share in this discussion and offer some of his perspectives on this topic that faces growing scrutiny as the devices become more intelligent. Joseph, welcome. So to kick it off, let's define the context of today's conversation around IoT.
Yeah, so I think IoT, or Internet of Things, really just refers to any device which is connected to the internet. And very often it's connected so that we can monitor what's happening with the device or issue it control. So very often it will be devices in and around our home. It may include simple things like our Wi-Fi routers, but it could also include our IP cameras, smart fridges, voice assistants, smart clocks, and so on and so forth. So some of the biggest players in this market will be people like Samsung, Google, Apple, even Xiaomi. And I think there's increasing popularity of such IoT devices because they do really have the potential to make our lives easier. Having everything at our fingertips that we can be controlled, when we're in the office, controlled from our mobile phones, it's really great from a usability perspective. But the main risk is that because these devices are now connected to the internet, it's also possible for them to leak information to non-authorized people or to be hacked into by attackers. I think we've all heard of examples of IoT hacks. We've seen instances where IP cameras were hacked wholesale by attackers to view what was going on in various people's homes. We've seen a lot of attacks against Wi-Fi routers, very often to launch attacks against targets on the internet. And so I think there's a lot of risk from both a security and privacy perspective for individuals who then choose to buy and use IoT devices in their homes. So I think we do need to be conscious as we buy our IoT devices that there is a risk to our privacy, there's a risk to identity fraud, and an attacker can monitor when you're at home. There's an increased risk of actually physical break-ins as well. And of course, if an attacker breaks into your IoT devices on your home networks, they could also steal data and files from your home intranets, for example. So we do need to be conscious that when these devices are exposed on the internet with public IP addresses, there is always a risk of compromise by attackers to these devices.
Definitely, it's one thing to read about these hacks, but it's another to experience one. And it really hurts when you lose a lot of personal data. And I can imagine a company losing critical corporate data. And naturally, as an individual, I feel exposed. This happened to me when, my NAS was hacked and ransomware was installed remotely from, Russia or wherever it was. And I lost all my data. 5 years of baby photos were all gone, all disappeared. So very, very personal, very painful experience. So with all this going on, Joseph, don't these manufacturers build security into their products?
Yeah, I think as consumers, we choose to buy these IP cameras, these NASs, because they are convenient to use, convenient to set up. And the manufacturers do try to provide some level of security into the devices to varying extents. But the question we really have to ask ourselves is whether it's truly enough to then protect what we are entrusting into these manufacturers' hands. What actually comes out of the box with, for example, the NAS that you set up? Is it kept up to date? Do they have a default password that attackers can break into? Are there vulnerabilities that allow attackers to break into the system and use it to compromise your data and take over control of the system? And increasingly, we are seeing that it's not just enough to secure, maybe just the IoT endpoint, but also the gateway, your Wi-Fi routers, the linkages to your social media sites. You may use Facebook to log in to your cloud data. You may use Google to authenticate to your IP camera. And all of these actually increase the exposure for consumer who is trusting that the manufacturer has really secured all these well enough. So the problem is that the habit of a user is, well, you unbox it, you plug it in, you configure it, and you kind of trust that the manufacturer has talked, internally and put in place proper encryption, proper privacy protections. But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
So many devices are being introduced. Every time you go to the store, you see a new device. The worry is, do you really think Google and Alexa are listening to us? And if they're listening, is anybody else listening? So what should I consider before I go out and buy that new device that hits the market?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think, data is everything for these companies. So whether you're a search engine, whether you're a social media company, they're all actually tracking our behaviors online. And we ask ourselves, do I trust them enough with their data? Even our voice data for the voice assistants, it is at least analyzed by, artificial intelligence. So, the same companies that are analyzing your email to decide what to sell to you are also analyzing your voice conversations to decide which ones are interesting from their perspective to the advertisers. So the challenge is that we may have to ask ourselves, is this a company that I trust? And we may say, well, maybe that's okay. But then the question also is, okay, if I do trust the company enough with whatever I'm giving them, do I trust that they're storing it in a safe way, transmitting it in a safe way, so that anybody else listening can also be trusted? And then we also ask ourselves, well, that's all great, but when I connect to it, could someone hack into my Google and gain access to my IoT devices, to my voice data, to my search history? So I think as a consumer, you really do need to research your purchases, try to change your habits around how you handle these services out of the box. Of course, use complex passwords, but also turn on second factor verification, second factor authentication wherever possible. For the devices that you do control in your, in your homes, of course, update the manufacturer firmwares and any related services automatically or frequently. We do need to understand that as consumers, we do need to try to buy devices that we trust and keep them up to date. And just be aware that whatever practices we've been putting in place around our security in our computers and our mobile phones also then need to translate into how we manage these IoT devices.
Finally, how do you see all these security concerns evolving? I mean, how will manufacturers circumvent these growing tensions between, these wonderful new features and the technological benefits, user privacy, because after all, this is in your house, it's very personal information. And of course, defending against those unethical hacks.
So the IoT ecosystem is actually a very broad ecosystem. On the one hand, you have very large manufacturers, your Apples and Googles and Samsungs and Xiaomis. On the other hand, you have very small, brandless manufacturers producing all sorts of devices as well that are connected to the internet. At least for the larger manufacturers, there is generally an incentive for them to try to roll out secure devices and secure ecosystems. So I am hopeful that over time, the security of these platforms will improve. One example that we've seen, for example, is Apple with their recent, virtual car key initiative. It does actually try to leverage upon the secure enclave in a mobile phone. So at least there's some baseline of security around that. But then the question for us is, well, is this available through other platforms? And even if it is available, how do I level up the security of that platform? Or even on Apple's platform, how do I, improve that security or use it in a way that meets my security or privacy requirements if that's not necessarily automatically built into that platform? So over time, I think these manufacturers will have to answer these questions. But I think as consumers, for a start, we just need to do our due diligence and try to understand what the companies have put in place around the security and privacy of the IoT devices before we choose to buy them.
Totally agree. Thank you, Joseph, for your wonderful insights into this topic. And there's certainly more for us to consider next time that new shiny gadget appears in the stores. So remember, research your product purchases, reset and personalize your digital identity, and make sure you keep them updated. This concludes our episode, and thank you for listening. Be sure to look out for more upcoming episodes in the links below, where we share more perspectives on other interesting trends in the cybersecurity space. Also, if you'd like to put some questions to us, please send these through in the email address below. And don't forget to follow us on our social media handles. for more frequent bite-sized security tips. I'd like to once again thank Joseph for joining us. Until next time, see you soon.